Hello guys, and welcome back to 30th Century Reverie Media. Today we have a quick little review of my thoughts on The Plague by Albert Camus. I finished this yesterday and I did a fairly deep reading. I've underlined stuff on most pages, but I'm going to try give an overview with no spoilers first, and then I'm just going to ramble, get all my thoughts out, and that'll be that. I'm going to keep it fairly short. First of all, The Plague. What's it about? A plague. It was released and published in 1947, so this was written in the aftermath of World War II. So the first thing that you kind of pick up on, even from the blurb, is that there is a bit of an allegory happening in the sense of Vichy France and the Nazis. But that is oversimplifying this book immensely. I totally get the resurgence this has had as well with the pandemic. But to contextualize this a bit more, the prose of the book. This was extremely emotionally moving, even if it was told in a very disconnected, detached manner. So, just quickly going to the afterword, Camus put a lot of his own feelings into this book. He was in Algeria during the war and he was cut off from his homeland and his mother and his wife, and he did not see them again until the Germans had been defeated. So illness, exile, and separation end up being three of the main themes of this book. Also a lot of harrowing imagery. I think I tripped up on that word, but as you can imagine, with some elements of the Black Plague, it can get very gory. I was gripped immediately by this book because in the first 20 or so pages, you're going to be encountering this very scary, mysterious rats dropping dead type of scenario, which is how the plague starts breaking out. The other big advantage in this book is that every main character had very strong, distinct ideological differences, because Camus is using this as a vessel to explore some questions around what it means to be a hero in some sense. Can you be a hero? So Dr. Ryu is explicitly said to not be very heroic, and in fact he makes kind of the civil servant character Grand out to be more of a hero. So the kind of why we should persevere is a big element of this book, which if you've read any of The Myth of Sisyphus and some of Camus' other writings, it makes a lot of sense that he is very concerned with why do we keep persevering even though things are so awful. And that is partially why this book is so good to me, because it gives a lot of different reasons for that. I think that the main thing with this book, though, is that it's not preaching at you. Camus doesn't want to say any which way is right exactly, but you can tell which characters he personally sympathizes and maybe feels the most like. Overall, on the advantages side, I would say that this is a very emotional story, with the exile and separation being a very big theme. Story of the survival through the epidemic, because it's an epidemic in this book, is very moving, so I would recommend it on that basis. Next, we have some disadvantages with no spoilers, really. In terms of female characters, not every single book has to have female characters, but the women in this book are all completely blank slates and absent, which again kind of makes sense, but some of the treatment of that is just a little bit a little poorly done. Like Dr. Rue's mother just seems to do nothing except wait for him to come around or something like that. So detached tone in the book. There's a couple of passages that felt a bit repetitive despite it being a fairly short book, and also were a bit clunky and wordy even. and it overall feels very clinical and trying to be objective. It even says this explicitly because it's told from the narrator's point of view. So if you don't really like detached tones in your books, maybe don't read this. Part 1 is mostly about the plague taking over, and there's lots of denial, and dismissal, which again, quite reminiscent of the pandemic. So you can see there's some slightly prophetic elements to this book, but I also think it's just kind of how other epidemics may have played out in the past too. We have to remember that the pandemic in 2020 was not the only pandemic, big widespread disease breakout ever. So descriptions of Iran, which is where this is set, city in Algeria, are fucking brilliant in this book. So the sky almost becomes its own character, and it just morphs and reacts to the plague as the plague progresses. So when you get to some of the really dark parts later on in the book, it just becomes like particularly clear that the sky is reacting to the plague. Especially one of the most horrific scenes, like the mass grave scene where they have to redirect the fumes from the mass cremation thing. That was very eerie. A couple of the really horrific elements in this for me were, again, that sense of abstraction and detachment are one of the main themes. So it plays out in many senses. One, as a way to cope with stress and the awful situation that they're trapped in. So again, spoiler, Dr. Ayu is revealed to be the narrator the entire time because he is just so detached from everything in order to cope with the loss of his wife, with just everything. And it even says several times, there's a few moments where his emotions build up and he just squashes them back down, because if he were to kind of accept that, he would just be completely overwhelmed and not be able to keep going. So the detachment, in one sense, is a coping mechanism. But in another sense, this theme of abstraction becomes part of the horror, because all the people who don't have an exact loved one being impacted by the plague have to detach as well. So you see this especially in the last part when the plague is receding, that there's a lot of joy while people are still dying. And we saw this happen in the pandemic as well. But there's also patting themselves on the back for like the clinical precision and efficiency of, you know, the systems that they built to get rid of the dying people, which again has some links with Nazism, because that is certainly a bit of what's going on in this book. But again, I think it's more just how we cope with all of this stuff. He's quite careful to not fully paint anything as evil. Even the plague itself is referred to as an innocent murderer at one point, which partially makes sense because it's just a microbe bacteria thing. It's not deciding to kill people, but it is. Again, can you tell Camus is a philosopher? Religion is a massive theme in the book, so you get a big discussion of free will versus you know, God and predestiny. Like, one of the characters is a preacher, and his whole shtick is almost like, yup, this plague is God's will and that stuff. And then, you know, you get a discussion where Dr. Yu is like, well, if I were to believe in God, I could just, you know, leave this all up to him, but I don't. And if I did leave it all up to him, you know, like, what would be the point in doing anything? So there's a lot of that going on too, you know, the plague, Christian martyrdom. So yeah, you can see there's basically a shit ton of ideas being played with. Overall, I would say there's not really any conclusion though, because the end is a warning that the rats could always come back. which is true, especially if we're leaning into the Nazism sort of angle. Like, one of the characters, Rambert, is, a collaborator and stuff, and he can't handle when the plague disappears. And so the ending with the old man being kind of a World War One veteran allegory, where he's like, "This is just life, bro." It functions more as a cautionary tale and a tale of survivorship rather than a kind of moral statement, in my opinion. I really enjoyed this overall, and it was my first time reading one of Camus' fiction works, so I will definitely check out more in the future. I definitely think you should read this. It's not perfect, but I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you for watching. This has been 30th Century Reverie Media Rambling, review number 1. Please subscribe for more.